All right, so welcome everyone to the guest speaker program of the U.S. Asia Law Institute here at NYU School of Law. I'm Catherine Wilhelm, the executive director. Before I introduce today's speaker and program, I just want to remind everyone about our next talk, which will be next week. It'll be another installment of the Taiwan Legal Series. This time we are asking, what does PRC law say about Taiwan? That is, what does the law of the People's Republic of China say about Taiwan? Our speaker, Professor Bing Ling, will be joining online from Sydney, and therefore the program is going to be in the evening of New York time, 7 p.m. on Tuesday, May 6th, but that will be the morning of Wednesday, May 7th in Sydney at 9 a.m. It'll be online only. So this week our guest is Malcolm Jorgensen, who is a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg. The topic is multipolarity, civilizations, and universality in international law. Malcolm is co-director of a research project on comparative international legal policy, which investigates the national, regional, and transnational political approaches that are shaping the international legal order. Earlier in his career, he was a legal advisor in the Australian Foreign Ministry, so he is speaking with his feet on the ground from real practice. His topic today, at first glance, may seem relatively esoteric, but upon a moment's thought, you will realize that it has considerable relevance for our current moment, as various powers seem to be challenging the existing legal system in multiple ways, sometimes openly and sometimes not. So where our program is 90 minutes, Malcolm will give us an overview of a new paper that he is writing about the new world order or orders that he sees emerging. And then we'll shift to questions. I'll open with some questions, and then everyone will have a chance to join both in the room and online. If you're online, please put your questions in the question app of Zoom.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see everyone here also online. The comments that I'll start today, I thought I would start with a question, which is not perhaps, it sounds easier than it really is, which is that how should international lawyers characterize the international political order? So this is a question that is perhaps not so intuitive for an international lawyer to ask, but if we think about it, international law is a dimension of global politics, and so our ideas of global political order, of course, have real consequences. In terms of trying to answer this question, how should we think about the international political order as international lawyers? I come from a comparative international law perspective. So actually, I think everyone in this audience will be relatively familiar with comparative international law. This field was re-enlivened by the work of Anthea Roberts in her book, Is International Law International? And essentially identified these different perspectives of international law that might be identified to particular countries or regions. And so she was gracious enough to write the foreword to my book on comparative international law, looking at the United States, different perspectives within the United States. And in that book, I partially looked at the way that different conceptions of the international political order can lead us to then understand different conceptions of law. That is, if there's a Chinese view of how the international political order is structured, that flows through into a particular view of law, and the same for the United States or Russia or other major powers who were looked at in Anthea's book. And so then taking that perspective of thinking, how should we think about the international political order? Some of the previous work that I've done has looked particularly at this concept of the rules-based order. So this is an idea that you've probably often heard from particularly Western governments talking about our commitment to the rules-based order. And this has different possible meanings, maybe just a positivist meaning, meaning just the international rules that are legal and also political and combining them under an umbrella term. But as a comparative international lawyer, I think about what comparative conceptions of international law might this help us understand? And I'd argue that it means particularly a particularistic conception of international law that's informed by primarily Western and liberal notions of global governance and their associated hierarchies of global power. So if we think of it in those terms, perhaps the best evidence that it has this meaning is the sharp rejection of the rules-based order by China and Russia and some other non-Western powers. who argue that the rules-based order concept draws away from commitment to international law. And so these countries talk about their own commitment to an international law-based order. But of course, these countries themselves have their own concept of the international political order, which can lead us to understand comparative conceptions. And so today, much of my comments will be focusing on the concept of the politics of multipolarity, because this is the concept that is promoted by some of these countries as an alternative to, for instance, the rules-based order, that we're moving towards a multipolar international order. So this concept, just as the rules-based order does, can have both a more analytical, strict meaning, so in international relations, it's simply a structure of global power with relatively equal distribution of capabilities between three or more consequential powers. But what I'm interested in is its potential comparative meaning, that those countries who invoke the concept of multipolarity, what do they intend for the concept of international law? And so if we start looking at these different potential meanings, we can see this politics of multipolarity, where there's a competition between many states who invoke this concept to mean particular concepts of international law. And so what I'll suggest today is that one of the ways we can think about both the rules-based order and multipolar international order and these different conceptions is that they all represent potential concepts of what I term geo-legality. So that is that we can see the geostrategic interpretation and operation of fundamental principles of international law up to and including especially sovereign equality. And so this provides something of an answer to how we can think about the international political order, that I would argue we're seeing something of a shift from an international legal order to one of geo-legal orders. So increasingly discordant geographies of international law within which spheres of influence and international law are co-constituted. So I'll spend a few moments talking about this concept and how it relates to multipolarity, and then I'd like to finish my comments talking about the case of civilizational claims that are being made by China, Russia, and increasingly and more recently by the United States, which we can interpret as a discourse for defining multipolar order in geo-legal terms. So thinking about this concept of the politics of multipolarity, the reason I focus on this is that it is becoming the increasingly dominant characterization of the international political order by a diverse range of states, but with an equally diverse range of meanings. And so if we then start looking at these particular concepts of multipolar order, at the most abstract level at best, I would argue that it serves as more of a metaphor for an inclusive and balanced international order compared to one defined by US and Western hegemony. But that if we actually start to look at the meanings intended by both large and small states alike, it masks real indeterminacies, such as how will the multiple poles of an order be defined, how might they avoid new manifestations of hegemony, and how might they nevertheless remain normatively bound together as an order. So perhaps relying on something of an oversimplification, there does seem to be a division emerging between those states who emphasize the prefix of multi to mean inclusivity, or those larger states who focus on the root notion of polarity, by which they mean balance. So if we start thinking about this division between inclusivity versus balance of power, for those states who focus more on this idea of multipolarity as inclusivity, this is primarily smaller and middle-sized powers who envision this greater multiplicity of voices as a bulwark against all forms of hegemony. So from a scholarship perspective, Onuma Yasuaki's international law treatise focused on what he terms the emerging multipolar and multi-civilizational world of the 21st century. And so in his view, multipolarity meant moving away from what he called a West-centric world towards one that takes greater account of both great civilizations and minor cultures alike in his terms. So this is this concept that is more focused on multiplicity of voices and inclusivity. However, some of the political trends in the international order point increasingly towards an alternative meaning, which is one focused on polarity as balance. And so this is something especially contemplated by powerful states who see the concentration of power amongst new dominant poles, including specifically a balance between their perceived or actual spheres of influence. So we can see the kind of statements that fit into this model in, for instance, the Russian government's 2023 foreign policy concept, where it identified itself as one of the sovereign centers of global development, performing a historically unique role aimed at maintaining a global balance of power and building a multipolar international system. Now, the implications of privileging balance over inclusivity are profound for international law, since it creates grounds potentially for asserting the political principle as being prior to ordinary rules and institutions of international law. So I'm sure some of you are already familiar with Carl Schmitt's concept of the Großraum, or a greater space in international law, which he modeled approvingly on the Monroe Doctrine, which he saw as a potential model for great powers, especially to remake the international order around their own spheres of influence. And it's not incidental that there are similarities between the ways some of today's leading countries are following some of the concepts set out by Schmitt, because Schmitt is explicitly embraced by many scholars and government advisors in China, Russia, and other states who are drawing out ideas explicitly of how to restructure the international order. So the concept of balance and what this means in the international order was especially prescient during the Cold War period, where Oskar Schachter identified and rejected what he called a balance of power exception. So by this, he meant the idea that the achievement of power equilibrium might become a ground for illegal use of coercion. This is not merely theoretical, but is the set of normative ideas that have justified Russia's invasion in the Ukraine war, for instance. So Rein Müllerson, who's a former legal advisor to the Soviet Union and is now in some ways a defender of some of Russia's legal positions, has argued that multipolarity is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for the existence of international law, and then on that basis justifies the Russian annexation of Crimea and its further actions within Ukraine, arguing that, in his words, it was meant to counter the further unfavorable change of balance of power that had already become threatening for Russia. And so in that sense, NATO expansion is a threat to international law, even if it doesn't breach any specific rules of international law. And so then we see here this emergence of this shift away from an emphasis on sovereign equality towards something that looks more like sovereign hierarchy and relativity, which is formed at the interface between international law and geostrategy. And so this brings me to this concept of geo-legality as being a key logic for the international order. So the first point to make is that if there is a move towards geo-legality, this is something of a decline of universality in international law. Now, universality is itself a deeply complex concept, which we could spend many hours talking about. I'm meaning it in the narrowest sense here of the idea that international legal norms might be interpreted and operate in a uniform way across time and space. That is, that they're geostrategically agnostic. A shift towards geo-legality, on the other hand, would see international law being reconstituted on geostrategic foundations that reinforce rather than overcome boundaries between multiple centers of power. So clearly the concept follows somewhat in the footsteps of geopolitics and the more recent concept of geoeconomics, with the latter, that is the field of geoeconomics, emerging as a rich field of study for understanding the increasing dominance of a geostrategic logic in global economics. I won't go into, for the reasons of time, Anne Orford's discussion of this, but we can perhaps talk about in the question and answer of what might be some of the benefits of talking about geo-legality in the international order. But there is this concept of thinking about the intersection of geostrategy and legal normativity and how that might understand some of the key trends in the international order. So I wanted to then explore this specifically in the case of civilizational claims by states, and how this can be understood in these geo-legal terms. And the first point to make here is that the concept of the universal does not then disappear from the international legal order if there are an emergence of geo-legal orders, as I've put them, but rather the concept of the universal remains as part of the politics of multipolarity. That is, the political contestation includes questions of what actually is the meaning of universality. That is, what normative constructions might be constant across space and time if legal rules themselves are not. And so in this space, civilizational identities have long informed the meaning of multipolarity for China, Russia, and other so-called civilizational states. And through this concept, they reach something of a reconciliation between geo-legality and universality through an essentialist understanding of the concept of civilizations. So this is in the terms put by Samuel Huntington, who's the most infamous proponent of this way of thinking about civilizations. His argument that differences among civilizations are not only real, they are basic. And so then this gives something like an organic basis for drawing out principles of international law if there's a belief that civilizations are this organic and most foundational level of the international order. But of course, I'm thinking more in these geostrategic sense of how civilizations might be used. And so Peter Katzenstein's view of this from 2009 is that civilizations are not important as a category, but rather it's the active reification or construction that is politically consequential and that requires political analysis. That is, for what purposes are civilizations constructed? And so when we start to step back and look at some of these civilizational claims, they essentially are designed to sustain unfalsifiable and expansive claims beyond the boundaries that would be recognized by geostrategically agnostic international law. So we can then start to look at some of the specific uses of civilizations in this sense and how they start to construct these geo-legal orders. So I'll spend a few minutes each on China and Russia very briefly, but actually then I want to move to talk about the United States, perhaps a bit more speculatively and provocatively, but I think that it's interesting in some ways to see the way that these ideas of civilizations are being constructed in a less familiar context. But the states who have long relied on these civilizational claims include foremost China. So, for instance, Martin Jacques in 2009 came up with the concept of China as a civilization state. And this has really been drawn upon by Chinese scholars. So Weiwei Zhang, for instance, has specifically cited Jacques' concept of China as a civilization state to argue that, in his words, China constitutes an endogenous civilization capable of generating its own standards and values. And this matters especially in a context where Zhang's ideas are reportedly embraced by the Chinese government, including directly by President Xi Jinping. So President Xi Jinping himself has certainly confirmed this idea of civilizations as being this organic concept in the international order. So as part of his vision for a common humanity, a common future for mankind, this concept that China is proposing as a way of informing the substantive norms of international order, he's proposed his Global Civilization Initiative. And in promoting that, he's talked about the existence of civilizations as having a unique and long tradition that, in his words, transcends time and space. And so reaffirming this idea of civilizations as having this organic existence. But what matters here from a geolegal perspective is how the territorial reach of China's civilizational claims can be understood in these geostrategic terms. And that as China has risen, it has faced the reality of the US being the dominant naval power in the Asia-Pacific, and has responded by asserting expansive legal rights to the South China Sea and to the areas that are geostrategically important around China. And so this starts to give us an understanding of where legal claims are made. And the last point I'll make is that, interestingly, this is now increasingly corroborated in China's terms by using archaeology to demonstrate the long existence of a Chinese civilization in these areas that are geostrategically important. So for instance, there's been a lot of emphasis in the Chinese media about finding treasures in the South China Sea here that show this ancient history of Chinese civilization precisely in these areas that are geostrategically important. So then just to say a few words on Russia, who is even more closely adhered to this idea of civilizations and promoted civilizations as the basis for multipolarity. Once we think in these geostrategic terms, then we can understand President Vladimir Putin's statement where he said that the Soviet Union's collapse was, in his words, the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. And what he was talking about here in part was this loss of balance in the international order. And then this fits in with the idea of Russia re-emerging as a civilizational pole of the international order, and especially in a context of upholding a particular conception of international law. So Alexander Dugin is sometimes referred to as Putin's brain, which is a little overstated, but he does have this connection to the government in terms of influencing some of the ideas and thinking in terms of civilizations. And so he's promoted this idea of each civilization having its own absolute, not relative truth, as he puts it. And these slides here are from a lecture he gave at Fudan University in Shanghai, where he explicitly repeats Huntington's concepts of civilizations and redraws the world in those terms. And so it does have this direct influence on the way the government thinks about the international order. But as I said, I would like to spend the last few minutes talking about the United States. So Jacques, who developed this idea of China as a civilization state, said in his work talking about China that the sense of cultural self-confidence and superiority of a civilizational state that China was able to rely on is largely unavailable to New World states such as the United States, in his words, which has no such legacy to draw on. But then this gives us a good opportunity to isolate the construction of geo-legal orders in civilizational terms. In a sense, there's already been this reification of the Chinese or the Russian civilization, where they're relied upon by scholars and the government alike. But we can actually see this process almost in real time happening in the United States, I would argue, in the way that civilizations are being increasingly invoked. So the first point to make here is that there is this recognition of the increasing fragmentation of political power in the global order. So Marco Rubio this year has said that there's now an inevitable return to, in his words, a multipolar world, multi-great powers in different parts of the planet. And this is really the first time that such a senior official in the US government has talked about the world in these multipolar terms. So that's the first element, the fragmentation of global political order. Secondly, Donald Trump previously has touted the concept of Western civilization. So some of those around him, people like Steve Bannon, for instance, have long talked about Judeo-Christian civilization. But Donald Trump specifically has talked about Western civilization. So in a speech in 2017 in Poland, he talked about, do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert and destroy it? And so promoting this idea of Western civilization. But what I'm most interested in here is there has been this shift in emphasis more recently. That is, Rogers Brubaker notes that Trump's nationalism is not culturally embedded in a broader civilizationism. It's almost entirely US focused. And so there has been this trend in this year alone of Trump citing a specific American civilization. So in Trump's second inaugural address, he talked about America as history's greatest civilization. And then in his State of the Union address, he pledged to forge the freest, most advanced, most dynamic, and most dominant civilization ever to exist on the face of this earth. So we can then pair this concept of the civilization with some of the geostrategic ambitions of the current government, and we can see some of these pieces of, well, where actually would this civilization reach in geographical terms, or more specifically, geostrategic terms? And so we see these inchoate geostrategic claims over Greenland, maybe Canada and Panama, in which, and this is perhaps a bit provocative, but it could be something like the emergence of a nascent civilizational corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. in the sense that Greenland is seen as more proximate to the American sphere of influence than it is to Denmark. And so this starts to be paired with legal claims, with Trump saying people don't even really know if Denmark has any legal rights to Greenland. He's challenged the validity of the 1908 treaty establishing the 49th parallel with Canada. And lastly, Panamanian rights to its canal, the canal of the same name, are by virtue of treaty agreements with the United States, thus giving some of the pieces for being able to promote expansive claims in legal terms. And in geo-legal terms, all that matters is that the claims that are made effective within a particular sphere of influence, even if they are incongruent with international law as recognized outside of that sphere of influence. So just as in a few words of conclusion, you might have noticed at the beginning of the talk, I had a cartoon of Donald Trump and Elon Musk carving up the globe. And that was itself a parody of this older cartoon from 1805 showing William Pitt, the British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, carving up the globe with Emperor Napoleon as an attempt to quell the violence of the Napoleonic Wars. So it was termed the plum pudding in danger. This attempt to carve up the world into spheres of influence failed to offer any resolution to the Napoleonic Wars. And much could be said the same about the emergence of geo-legal orders. So the concept of multipolar international order as it's been invoked, especially one constructed around civilizations, is a site for reproducing rather than overcoming forms of geostrategic hierarchy and exclusion. And thinking in terms of geo-legal orders refines our understanding of how multipolarity is being defined to mean co-constitution between international law and spheres of influence. And the final thing I would say is that as international legal scholars, what does this then mean? Well, we face the task of mapping some of these discordant geographies of international law, but also while perpetually interposing alternative universalities against one another in order to expose their embedded hegemonies. So thank you very much for listening.
Okay, although that last slide, I actually want to pivot right off of that last slide, but that's fine. So you kind of left us just when it was starting to get interesting. Like, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Where does this leave us, or where does this point us to, I guess? What are the implications, both in terms of conflict, in other words, because you're talking about both power and law, so what are the implications for greater conflict? It seemed to me you were pointing in the direction of a world that might inherently be more conflict-ridden, not that we've exactly been in a time of peace, but potentially, but also the consequences for international law and lawyers. I mean, do we all lose faith in international law except as a set of rules that the big hegemons maybe pay attention to when it suits their interests or not? So just to recap, what the implications are for both peace in the world, conflict in the world, and the implications for international law continuing to have meaning beyond the barest kind of rules amongst big powers that they adhere to when it's convenient to them to adhere to and ignore when they think they actually have the upper hand in real power. In other words, total realpolitik. Where do you see this going? How far do you want to take your own argument?
Well, the first point that I'm making is, first of all, we need to pull away some of the covers that have been provided by these concepts such as multipolarity or rules-based order, that we need to understand the hegemonies behind them. And so I think that in terms of the trajectory of this debate, it's important to, I think, deconstruct the idea of multipolarity, because I agree with many of the criticisms of the rules-based order or the liberal international order that this does represent forms of hegemony, that the reasons that maybe there's been unity in the international order is as a consequence of power hierarchies. And so I would agree with some of those criticisms that are put by some of these leading non-Western countries. But multipolarity itself has been constructed with its own new hegemonies. And so it's important to then understand and exactly how those are being constructed, and to see some of the similarities between multipolarity and the rules-based order, if we can summarize these different concepts in those terms. But there isn't then a clear answer of then how to construct a quote-unquote universal international law. That I think the reality of the interpretation and the operation of law is that it will have these discordant geographies. I think that's separate from a purely normative question, but of course, the normativity and the politics at some point interact. That is, that we can have the theory of a universal international law and say, this is the one international law, and there's all of these other things happening in different spheres of the world. But over the course of time, consistent application of norms that are effective within particular regions, that's how international law is formed. So the German scholar Wilhelm Greve, for instance, talked about epochs of international law, where when Britain was the dominant maritime power or Spain was the dominant power, international law reflected the views of those states. And so that's something that could happen in the trajectory of international law now. There's been something like an American epoch of international law, and that might be coming to an end. But I think the intermediate phase will be these discordant geographies. And so it's about uncovering those hegemonies, but it's going to depend on the political power that's worked out. That is, that international legal normativity alone can't resolve this question. And then the last point to make is that one of the ideas that lays behind those who promote the idea of multipolarity is the structure for international law is that this will be a fairer, more peaceful, and more inclusive order. But we can see that those states who fall into what we might think of as civilizational interstices, states such as Ukraine is the prime example, who have claimed by different civilizations or look to one quote civilization while being drawn in by another, that violence will continue in these states. And so the idea of carving up the world into spheres of influence is not itself either a recipe for peace and order in the world.
Right. Well, civilizations, of course, is a tar pit, because the great power can use that to say, well, if you're Chinese, for example, you're always Chinese.
Yes.
You can't escape from the Chinese civilization, so we can't let Taiwan go. On the other hand, you could very easily define Chineseness in such a way that it includes Korea and Vietnam, because they have at different points in time belonged to China. Yes. And so civilization can be expanded and it probably not contracted, but it can be very easily expanded.
No, absolutely. I mean, I have a quote here from Samuel Huntington that proves this point. So Huntington has this essentialist concept of civilization, and it's been very influential in China especially. So Chinese leaders always say, we don't believe in Huntington, we don't believe in the clash of civilizations. But they're actually reifying his more fundamental claim is that civilizations exist as an organic element of the international order. That's really what Huntington's putting out there, and that they're accepting. And so, I mean, Huntington infamously said, if civilization is what counts, violence between Ukrainians and Russians is unlikely. These are two Slavic, primarily Orthodox peoples who have close relationships for centuries. It really demonstrates that these civilizations are constructed around, especially these geostrategic ideas. And so I agree with you that civilizations become this hegemonic device. And I think that's what I was trying to illustrate with the American example, is that it's almost taken for granted that there's a Chinese civilization. You have even American leaders or leaders from the United Nations have appeared in China, in Beijing, and talked about Chinese civilization, repeating the words of the Chinese government. But it's interesting to see actually the construction of it in real time in the US case. There's somebody around Donald Trump who's talking about civilization. There must be a reason why he's sort of used it repeatedly in a couple of speeches now. And so there is a set of ideas circulating around civilization. It was also in the first term, Karen Skinner, as the director of the policy planning in the State Department, said that China would be the first non-Western civilization who the United States was opposing, and so that was different to Russia. And so there is this talk around there, but I agree that it is for these hegemonic reasons that civilization has been invoked.
Well, in the 1980s, I recall that I was in Beijing at the time. Huntington's book was very very widely read and talked about all the time. And as you say, they loved the idea of civilizations. They just denied conflict because their emphasis was China needed to come up in a peaceful world. We need to have a peaceful world so that we can rise up or we can develop. They didn't use the term peaceful rise that hadn't yet been coined, but we needed peace so that we could develop our economy. So we're not interested in confronting anyone, but absolutely, they always believed in civilization as a core concept. But it is strikingly new for the United States, and it feels extremely awkward for a settler colonial country to talk about civilization. How can that stick?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a recognition of the resonance of talking in civilizations. It gives you this unfalsifiable claim. And so you're right, it's unfalsifiable for those other countries who reach back thousands of years. It's hard to say exactly where the territorial boundaries of China were 5,000 years ago, which is essentially the claim being made. And so in the United States, it's only going back a few hundred years. But the discourse becomes recursive in the sense that if the United States talks about the civilizations, it legitimizes the claims of Russia and China. And when they talk in those terms, it then starts to legitimize what the United States is doing. And so Vladimir Putin, for instance, has said that he can understand Donald Trump's claims to Greenland. He said that there was a long history of the United States making these claims. He can understand that they have geostrategic interests, and he specifically said geostrategic interests in the Arctic, and so is actually trying to add some legitimacy to the American civilizational claims because it fits into the broader narrative.
Well, it fits into the geostrategic goals, but they don't speak English, or maybe they do actually. Their Europeans will speak English so well, in many languages so well, but it's hard to see a civilizational tie.
It's within Europe.
With Greenland.
Yes, of course. I mean, there's no civilizational tie, but of course these civilizations are often constructed, and so that's the point. Is that so? In the case of Xinjiang province in China, there's white paper. The Chinese government put out a white paper talking about the joint civilization between the people of Xinjiang province and China, but reached back hundreds of years and pointed out that, yes, there had been this Arab influence, but the Chinese influence was earlier. And so having to make that claim way into the past. And so you can start to construct these narratives. And so I can only speculate on the kind of narratives which might be talked about in terms of Greenland, but part of it is then geostrategic and the civilization follows, in a sense.
So I want to just, before I open it, I'm sure everybody's got a lot of comments and questions, ask sort of, to what extent is this nothing new under the sun? You know, just more realpolitik, or people will talk about return to Westphalian politics, or going back even earlier, this is great power politics, power driving law, or even the absence of law. It sounds in some ways familiar to the first Cold War, which I grew up in, and at that time, there was much less discussion about universal norms. I don't remember hearing about that in my college days, universal norms, unless you were possibly in a religion, a theology, or a philosophy class. So is this such a big shift, or is this just the world turns and we revert to something that we previously always have been or frequently have been in between periods of very unusual unipolarity of there being a global hegemon?
Yeah, so the first point is I mentioned Anne Orford's work on regional international law. And so she said, in her words, forms of law that enable powerful states to control and manage greater spaces have been and remain a central feature of international law. That there have always been these structures of power which favor regions. It's never been even anyway, which is true. But in terms of going back, I mean, this is one of the characterizations that we're going back to a previous era. It changes, though, when you've had a period of an aspiration to universality, and that international lawyers have seen potential ways that there might be more preferable norms, whether they're liberal or whatever concept there is. And so our horizons have changed in the last generation, even, about what is possible for international law. And so yes, there might be a shift back politically to these spheres of influence, but what seems possible has changed over time, that the normative idea of what's possible in the international order has developed. And so I think that as international lawyers, we can keep having a progressive idea of what's possible in the international order. But yes, a lot of it will be dependent then on a return to spheres of influence. And it might be that this looks something like a return to the Cold War, where we'll have something like the Brezhnev Doctrine again in Russia, and the United States follows in an enlargement of the Monroe Doctrine. And so, yeah, we're drawing somewhere between a return to history, but also trying to build upon ideas of what actually seems possible.
And if we're doing that, then what would be the example you would want to cite as, for those who want to aspire or hold on to that ideal of the success of that brief shining period of universality or unipolarity or whatever you want to call it? What would the great success of that era be that you would say, see, this was only possible in a world where we did have universal norms, or we at least aspired to have and promoted them? What triumph? So, for example, is there a small state that was able to use international law to vindicate itself against a large state peacefully? What would what should our touchstones be? What should we be remembering fondly?
I mean, international law has always been ridden with hypocrisy. That has always fallen short of what was promised. But the discourse around, and then I can only speak then partially, as a comparative international lawyer, I'm not myself neutral, is that perhaps it's because I've always been trained in the West, is that believing in the promise of human rights. And so the fact that there is this discourse about human rights and that countries aspire to it, I think was partly possible through some of these some of the structures of power that followed the Cold War, even though I could point to more examples of hypocrisy and where the liberal international order actually led to violence and so on. But the fact that there is this discourse, I think, continues, and that these countries from the global south, especially, who invoke the idea of a multipolar order to mean inclusivity, a multiplicity of voices, that part of the discourse of then, okay, but what is the substantive concept of international law that those countries aspire to? It can include some of these ideas that have been successful or at least become normatively talked about over the last 20 years or so. And so then I can think of small states. Actually, I'm probably being partial because Schwann's in the audience. And he spoke at our conference about Singapore's experience in international law. And that's an example of a small state, I think, who sees international law as existential. That if other countries don't respect international law, then they just don't exist. And so these basic rules of sovereignty, I think, are probably the most fundamental of the rules that have been successful. And at least sovereignty was held as this norm, and that even though it was often breached, at least there was this hypocrisy of still appealing to the norm of sovereignty. But now we see even sovereign equality, the most fundamental norm, being disagreed upon within spheres of influence. And so I think even the most narrow version of international law, the thinnest concept of the international rule of law, even that is under threat. I think once sovereign equality starts to be reinterpreted within geographical spheres of influence.
So just the sheer number of countries in the world now that are independent sovereigns, perhaps that is the great achievement of the international legal order post-World War II.
I think so. The fact that there was at least this idea of sovereign equality. And so, I mean, international law is always somewhat about the idea that we hold out, and the fact that there are so many examples where we don't live up to that ideal doesn't change the idea that we still hold that ideal out there. But the ideal is being directly eroded, where we start, where these major powers that I talk about have potential aspirations over the sovereign equality. So the sovereign rights of countries in the South China Sea, sovereign rights of countries in the former Soviet sphere, or potentially in this enlarged or new Monroe Doctrine, as we might put it.
Right, right. Okay, so let's start to take questions. Yes, please, and turn on your mic. Don't imitate me.
Is that on? Yeah. Does that work? Yeah.
Yes.
So two potential differences, and it might actually just be history repeating itself, but love to get your take on this. So if we think of civilization as more than culture, like a collection of cultures and the rules and norms around a collection of very disparate cultures, right? In the past, it was more about rent extraction and the transactional notion of like, hey, these cultures, I need to get my tax, I need to get my to power civilization and make them work together. The first point I think that might be a little bit different is that a lot of these, call it civilizations, that are labeling themselves are trying to push a monoculture down that in the past was more of like, you know what, when I come visit you as the emperor, yeah, don't piss me off, but like you're over there, and as long as the money's coming, I'm getting my gold. I don't care if you, decide to pour your tea with a mug or whatever, right? And now that's changing a bit. It's my understanding. B, take Okinawa, right? Like in that perspective, they would pay their tribute to both Japan and China, and they didn't give a shit, right? But now with digital and like this notion of that was all geographical. So now cultures and civilizations are not geographically close to each other. So if I know that I have to deal with whatever LLM provider, ChatGPT or whatever, and that's one of my, I'll call it rent extraction for lack of a better term, that's the American sphere. But I know Huawei is where my network is being served, and just in the commercial terms, I now have two radically different, I'm a vassal to two radically different people that both, quite frankly, can never even come to my country because I'm far flung. But now I have to manage this. And not only that, when I'm saying, yes, of course I'm in the American sphere, yes, of course I'm in the Chinese sphere, that's not just when they visit, it's inherently obvious instantaneously around the world. So I'm going to be forced to make a choice and make that choice continuously, if that makes sense. So I think those are two different aspects to what was in the past to now. There is no hiding. You can't hide your opinion when the emperor shows up. And B, the emperors are demanding not just the gold. They're saying, no, you be part of my culture now, not just my civilization.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem, the hegemony of these civilizational claims, is that part of the reason that the Roman civilization, if we can call that, or Rome, was so successful was that it allowed so much regional difference. That there were so many cultures that, as long as they paid fealty to the Roman emperor, there actually was like local leaders were in charge and so on, and so there was this diversity. And that doesn't seem to be the case in, say, the Chinese civilization or the Russian one, as again, the US is more speculative here. But there is this enforcement of Chinese cultural identity, the Han identity, essentially, within China, speaking Chinese Mandarin. And so there is this attempt to make this more uniform. And that's the case even in, say, Western culture, the Western civilization, because of course there's also this idea of Western civilization, which covers Europe and the United States, maybe Australia. It's all a bit amorphous what it actually is. But there are attempts in some of the domestic politics of those countries to also create some kinds of exclusion and cultural uniformity by keeping out immigrants who aren't part of Western civilization. That's the meaning that Trump had in 2017, where he talked about saving Western civilization. And J.D. Vance at the recent Munich Security Conference in Germany talked about the need to save civilization, and he meant keeping immigrants out of Europe to save Western civilization. And so there is that attempt to construct the domestic politics to enforce that. And so it becomes all constructed, and the last element of that is that part of Donald Trump's arguments when he was trying to defend the idea of Western civilization was he was trying to argue that Russia was part of Western civilization. And so the civilization was being defined to bring Russia in and keep China out. And so that shows, again, the porous borders between these civilizations and how they're used for geostrategic purposes. I hope that kind of gets to what you're talking about a little bit. So,
Well, I mean, we all know Taylor Swift is the only thing about Western civilization that's consistent, right? So,
yes.
yeah.
Yes.
Hi, excellent presentation, discussion today. You know, NATO, as an American, I look at NATO and say, wow, it's really going through a lot of very dynamic changes, probably the most I've seen in my life as far as you talked about, you know, the Islamic influence or whatever's going on. I just wonder, you know, it's the strangest thing where like Russia is one side, the United States is one side, China's one side. I see as a whole, is there a shift of everybody going to a different side, so to speak, as far as teammates, if you would?
I mean, it seems that some in the Trump administration hope so, that they're trying to remake the divisions in the international order and bring Russia onto the American civilizations, a shared Western civilization. But I think that if we then think geostrategically, that there's good reasons to think that the kind of alliance that Russia and China have formed geopolitically and that they've tried to reinforce through normative statements of saying they're both committed to a type of international order, they have a far greater geostrategic interest in opposing Western hegemony and to remake the international order. And so I think that's going to prevail over any of these attempts to claim that there's some joint civilization that's Western that will prevail over that. So I'm pretty skeptical about the idea that there's going to be such a large realignment. At most, we might see that the United States falls in line with the kind of worldview of these other great powers in terms of spheres of influence, rather than a realignment where everyone's going to turn against China, which is kind of the hope of some in the administration, it seems.
One other question for you. You know, I used to attend Professor Jerome Cohen. Used to have a lunch here. It was really terrific over the years. And Vietnam, what do you know? We don't hear enough about Vietnam here, but I'm just wondering about the evolution of Vietnam, where it is today, and perhaps your thoughts. You know better than we do.
Probably not, actually. I'm not an expert on Vietnam, unfortunately. I probably can't say too much on that. That was another country caught up in, I wouldn't talk about in civilizations, but this idea of who is part of us and who's part of them.
Yeah.
This is another manifestation of that, and that's what Vietnam was who's part of us and who's part of them. And that when you had this idea that you could clearly define who these groups were, those caught in the middle is where all the violence happens. So.
Terrific.
I think Vietnam, to a large extent, defines itself as the country that has defeated China more times in war than anyone else. So they definitely don't want to be part of the Chinese civilization.
No, definitely not.
We have a question online. How would this civilizational concept play out when setting policies for migration? The writer here says, I'm thinking of Muslim immigration to Europe, for instance, which Carl Schmitt would probably consider, you know, a civilizational attack, one civilization attacking an invasion, as Donald Trump likes to say. So what would rules of migration and travel be in this new order of orders? And also thinking about that, it makes me wonder about trade. But start with immigration.
I think I somewhat answered that by citing I think the Vice President J.D. Vance's comments at the Munich Security Conference summed that up well, and he did talk about it in civilizational terms, that he sees this erosion of Western civilization through particularly Muslim migration, but non-Western migration to Europe. And so I think it has a clear racial element to that. I mean, I've spent a lot of time reading the works of, for instance, Alexander Dugin and these other people who cite Schmitt, and the word gets thrown around too much, but it's as my understanding of fascism, as that's what it looks like in terms of the kind of words of Carl Dugin, that he talks about civilizations have an absolute identity. You have to have an absolute identity of your civilization in order to be able to confidently engage with another civilization, and that absoluteness includes racial. And so you have to, so I think that's the implication for migration policies. So what's the second part of the question?
Well, I added on a question about implications for trade.
Implications for trade.
What would a trade regime look like in this new order that you're talking about, in which most of the current commonalities have fallen away, and it's realpolitik amongst these power blocks?
Well, there's a difference between the power blocks and how they see trade. So obviously China still believes deeply in a liberal trading order.
But the other orders, the other blocks may not wish to have Chinese products coming in.
No, I mean, if anyone can tell me precisely what the US government's trying to do, then like, I think it's unclear. I won't even repeat it because I think everyone's familiar with the incoherence of, are they trying to reshore trade or are they trying to remake deals and so on. So it's a little unclear what actually is happening there. I'm not sure that civilizations can necessarily shed light onto trade in that sense.
Right, no, not civilization's part, but the realpolitik part does, right? So if we no longer have universal rules, then we don't have WTO, which already we don't have WTO. It's kind of shuttered to some kind of not a total halt, but it's very, very restricted now. So if you don't have these universal rules that create a norm of accepting each other's goods with some exceptions carving out, instead you go to, a Trump set of trade rules, which is you just basically start from the premise that it's best not to trade. It's best to make what you need. Then I could, if that direction becomes institutionalized, then you would have a lot less trade, presumably, in this world.
Yes, I think so. I think this is where the idea, I think about it in terms of geo-legal orders, that China is leading initiatives to basically to make effective the WTO rules outside of the WTO through some of its agreements with other countries, that it will essentially follow WTO rules with other countries through separate agreements. And so then you have these discordant geographies where trade works this way over here, but it might work under a different set of rules over here in the United States. I mean, I assume at some point there'll be some equilibrium or more consistently reached from the US side, and those rules might not look exactly like the WTO rules, that there's a different set of rules that apply on this side. So there's these uneven geographies is probably how I think international trade will shift.
Right, but so much human migration follows along with trade and and the logic of commerce, right? So we have, of course, a large body of people now around the world who are living and working in countries other than their native country, on long-term basis or short, with multinational companies or as agents of trade and so on. So those things are tied up. The worst case scenario that I can envision from the direction that you've discussed would be that all of that kind of gets very much throttled back and we are much less globalized, right? So this is the anti-globalization vision then. And we are much back to being in our own spheres. And so we become more ignorant of the rest of the world. There's less cross-communication, there's less cross-fertilization of ideas, less sharing of cultural artifacts, et cetera. It's a duller world.
I agree. I think that is the risk, and that there's a real possibility of that. The trends in Germany are also now the second largest party is the AfD, who is a neo-Nazi party, essentially. And so they would welcome that world in many ways, that it's more insular. And you mentioned Carl Schmitt before. It again fits into Schmittian ideas of the ideas that the people of a country should have an attachment to the lands and these kind of spatial understandings of international law, which I think that's an example of the kind of thinking that it was maybe a benefit that we've got away from in the last decades, and that'll be it'll be pretty drastic and disruptive and awful to return to that.
So I've had the benefit of reading your draft paper, the one that Catherine distributed to some of us. And I guess the reaction I had is that it would be very useful, or perhaps you're doing it in a longer work, to make it less seem like a literature review. That is, most of what I read sounded like, okay, you add Schmitt, you add Oscar Schechter, and then you add stuff you didn't recognize, like the Yale School, which was the opposite of Schechter, which was all about balance of power as defining the end result that the U.S. should follow. And I guess I would urge you to answer the first question posed on what is new that would make this different beyond Sam Huntington and his notion of a clash of civilizations, and to consider the world of digital, the world of global commons problems like climate change, where it seems very difficult to resolve them unless you do something across your civilizations. And if that were added to the project, then I think people might appreciate that there's novelty here. But I guess there's one other question I raise, which is, you suggest that the three, the US, Russia, and China, are following a common, what you call geo-legal approach. I see China doing the geo-legal. I don't see Russia and the US, at least till now, following any attempt to really try to adhere to rules at all. That is, when you see the attempt to justify the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there was no law there at all. When you see what the US is now doing, there's no appeal to norms or rules. It's the opposite. So I'm not sure they're playing the same game. But when I look at China, at least as I understand it, it is not just an attempt to redefine international law or rules within its, quote, sphere of influence. China is far more ambitious than that. What they're doing in trade is to build a new conception of what the global rules would be, where China gets what it considers a fair shake. But that's a different game than what, at least till now, I see the US playing, or Russia's more limited game. And let's face it, Russia, as compared to the other two, is a minor player. So if what another vision of what this could lead to is in the current issue of foreign affairs, whereas this is a pure transactional world, very much reminiscent of what Catherine was saying about old rules, where if all that would happen is, for example, the US, that is Putin and Trump, agreeing on a set code of conduct, they would dominate the Security Council. China would not exercise the veto all by itself. And then we have a new potential axis of evil using all the tools of regular hegemonic law, but for different normative outcomes. That maybe you want to call that geo-legal. I just call that a new form of old hegemony that happens to reshuffle the players. And so I'm curious whether you really think that those three players are playing the same geo-legal game.
Thank you for the questions and the very useful comments, and thank you for reading the paper. It's happening on two levels. And so on one level, there's a global game being played by China, as you rightly point out, and that's distinct from the geo-legal, or the game that's been played in a geostrategic sense. And so both things are happening at once, I would suggest. And so there is one level where I would argue that these countries are doing the same thing. So China does have these larger global ambitions. I mean, people talk, there's more likely to be a bipolar world than a tripolar world or something like that. And so China is actively creating the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, remaking the rules of international institutions that already exist in its favor. And so there is that global game. But I think that there is this regional approach to international law of China. So I think the strongest example is in the South China Sea, that the rules that China states in the South China Sea, its historical rights, are unrecognized by most international lawyers outside of China, but they're the effective rules in the region. And so under President Duterte, for instance, the Philippines started to follow those rules and started to work with China in terms of those rules. And so they weren't necessarily being recognized as law, but they were effective norms that were followed for at least political reasons. And so there's no reasonable prospect of dislodging China from any of the islands that it's taking control of in the region. And so the rules that China says are international law in the South China Sea are the rules that will govern that region, whether they're political or legal. They're political rules, really. And Russia, I think that I would give. I think that there is an attempt to create some normative consistency on the Russian side. There are scholars, people like Ryan Mullison, who I noted, who try and develop a consistent set of normative ideas of how Russia behaves in its region. And so obviously Russia is not being constrained by law in any way, but it is trying to create forms of normative consistency, I would argue, and that civilizations is one of the ways that this has been done, that it's something like a new version of the Brezhnev doctrine, that you create this normative principle that upholding socialist systems means that we can intervene in any of the countries in this region. And now it's upholding Russian civilization is a reason why we will consistently intervene in different countries within our region. And so I think that international law could increasingly operate the way that Russia claims in its region. So if there's a peace settlement reached with Ukraine, largely under Putin's terms, which is one of the possibilities at the moment and more likely now, then what Russia says is the meaning of sovereignty and its sphere of influence will actually determine the rights of Ukraine in that region, even if that only is recognized in that geo-legal order of Russia. And so there is that similarity there. And as I said, the United States is a little more speculative, but I don't think that's going to happen. But in one version, where the United States takes control of the Panama Canal or Greenland, again, I think it's highly unlikely, but then the way that the United States talked about its rights to do that, and they have talked about treaty rights, for instance, in relation to these lands, they haven't just ignored international law, then what they say is international law could look in a particular way. And so I think a clear example of where American geostrategic influence has created a set of norms that are effective but aren't recognized outside of the region is in the Golan Heights in Israel. So Israel's claims over the Golan Heights are unrecognized under international law, but under the first Trump administration, Mike Pompeo wrote a piece, I think, for the Wall Street Journal, saying that Trump's policy is confirmed by international law. The heading was something like that. And reinterpreted as a UN resolution in a completely inconsistent way, but went through the process of making the legal arguments. It still fitted under the idiom of international law. And what was said to be international law is effective in the Golan Heights and will be for the foreseeable future. And so this is what I mean, where we might you have to start engaging with having an understanding of how law is interpreted within particular geostrategic reasons, not because that is what we all then recognize as international law, but these are the discordant geographies of how law works in practice. And I think that's the level in which I think there is a similarity between some of these powers and the way that they use international law.
That was an interesting question that you raised, because I had been thinking of sort of the inverse of the question, which was whether there were any differences in what China and President Trump and Russia in their approaches to international law in terms of just thinking, well, power first. And so to some extent, that I don't see normative differences amongst them. Do you see normative differences amongst them? I mean, I think what you were just arguing is that there's a difference in endgame and that there's a difference in targets or arguments. But normatively, are they more or less, is there a distinction that you would say, or are there certain rules? Well, you mentioned trade. I guess I should grant that. I was going to say, are there certain rules that one embraces and the other rejects? So China embraces WTO and open trade regime. But is there anything else that you could think of that we'd?
I mean, the main rule that I've thought about, because it's the sort of the cornerstone of the international order, is that of sovereignty. That I mean, Russia and China are often grouped together as being these sovereigntist powers that they believe in a strict Westphalian concept of sovereignty, which I push back against slightly, because their concept of Westphalian sovereignty is then relative and hierarchical within a particular sphere of influence. And so I think that's probably where I would look if I was trying to see if there are any normative similarities or differences. Again, I think the US case is a bit too inchoate at this point to start drawing a direct comparison of whether Trump's a sovereigntist or anti-sovereigntist and so on. I think that's just sort of not perhaps useful at this
Right.
stage. Yeah.
We'll leave that to historians to sort.
Yeah.
So I'll bring another question from online and then come back to the room. So the question is asked, this is Adele Karai, who I think is back from NYU Shanghai this week. When thinking about geo-legal dynamics, there's an important geographical dimension to consider. If you were to create a map of geo-legal influence, how would you represent it? Where would you place locations on the map, and how would you represent China's geo-legal influence? Would it be through legal text, through institutions, organizations, geographies that take into account sovereign nations, or something else?
So thank you for the question. I would be very hesitant to start drawing maps in that way. One of the slides, I had Alexander Dugin's lecture from Fudan University, where he tried to draw out essentially these geostrategic spheres of influence. And I think that you start to reify these borders and make the borders seem clearer than they really are. I mean, the whole point I'm trying to make is that there are these complex geographies. And so in some areas, the geography will look in some way, that is in global security, in trade, it'll be a different set of borders. And so I'm thinking it's there's different levels of the geography. We can't just draw it on a two-dimensional map, I think. And in terms of how actually then we do nevertheless understand the borders of these different geolegal orders, is that then it would be all of the texts and the statements of the governments that the claims that they make in terms of sometimes they'll be more explicit about actually making claims over particular regions. But I'm also thinking of other statements where you have to read the geolegal implications, such as China's acquiescence to Russia's claims in Ukraine and the former Soviet space, that China has never explicitly said that Russia's claims are legal in those areas, but it has agreed with Russia's claim that the cause of the war is NATO expansion. And so then that has geostrategic implications of, that then feeds into the idea that part of the problem here is that the balance has been lost in the international order, and that this war might actually improve the balance and therefore strengthen international law. And so it's even these indirect statements, I think, which can help draw these different borders.
I find it interesting that when people do engage in this border drawing exercise, there seems to be some kind of an assumption that Russia is the European hegemon when it's clearly not able to be. And I don't see the EU lifted up. It's assumed, I guess, to be militarily too lightweight to be a hegemon.
Yeah, I mean, there's something of a vacuum of power in the European continent as a whole, in the sense, and that's part of what's been contested. Is that I think Vladimir Putin rightly recognized that Western Europe is underdefended, and that he got away with Crimea almost completely, and so that was, from his perspective, that was a geostrategically clever move, because he calculated the weakness of the other side and that they didn't respond, and then relations were normalized. Germany continued to build the Nord Stream pipeline after Crimea. And so then he thought, well, if I can get away with that, I can do more, but then overcalculated it. And so I think that's part of the problem, is that there's not a clear structure of power such that law can then be fixed onto it in a determinate way.
But then isn't that the same problem for, say, large other chunks of the globe, be it South America or Brazil, for example, which is not clearly going to be just an American satellite, and Africa, and obviously the Middle East is very contested, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, these balances are still developing, and so President Lula da Silva is one of the strongest advocates of multipolarity and welcomes this as one of the important developments of the 21st century. And I think that his meaning of it is then somewhere caught between this idea of more inclusivity, but also maybe also contemplating some level of hegemony on the part of Brazil in the region. And so it's all been contested at this point, and part of that power structure has been worked out, but then law will follow from that, I think.
I have to maybe one broader question, which is kind of touching on what Catherine mentioned about whether this whole situation is kind of more of the same. And I think first, I wonder whether this whole situation is more the same as in whether civilizational claims have become more popular because they allow people or governments to essentially make ethnic or racial or cultural claims while pretending they're not being racist or not being ethno-nationalistic, because they're saying, well, we are protecting our civilization instead of, saying the things which they rather not say, which is maybe perhaps we're protecting white supremacy, for instance, or protecting a certain kind of culture. Yeah, and so that's kind of my question of whether this is more of the same in terms of the whole civilization aspect. And I think I also have a question of whether this is more of the same in the whole multipolarity aspect also, because I think if we look at history from a longer perspective, multipolarity has sort of always been more of the norm. And it's only in the past century where it's a bit of, if you think of it this way, the past century has been an aberration to have the idea of a universal international law, which everyone agrees on, which is, and a sort of an international liberal order. And whether in that sense, multipolarity has, it's not really something new. It's just something which has come back again. And I'm also thinking about, from a small state perspective, from a big state perspective, if you're sort of the US, you kind of don't see the world as becoming more multipolar now, right? But if you're a small country, you've always lived in a multipolar world because any neighbor that's bigger than you is another source of power and influence, which can affect the way you do things. So yeah, this is just some questions. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Ron. So in terms of it being more the same, I completely agree with the ethnic cultural element to it. That, a lot of the research on the invocation of civilizational claims in Europe is that it closely tracks far-right nationalism. That's political groups at the domestic level who are white nationalists have invoked civilizational claims in terms of Western civilization or Judeo-Christian civilization. And it's a way of being able to say we want white people without having to say we want white people. We say it's Western civilization or Judeo-Christian civilization. And so it's a way of being able to assert, I think, these racial hierarchies without having to explicitly say so. And then that's the same for other civilizations. So the rise of Hindu nationalism, for instance, and the idea of a greater India that reaches across the region is also moving towards a monocultural idea that's also includes racial hierarchies. And so I think civilizational claims are deeply intertwined with these kinds of monocultural ideas of race and so on. In terms of multipolarity being more of a norm over history, some of the analysis of multipolarity has said that the proper term of multipolarity is really the concert system in Europe. This was the clearest, that was a concrete example of multipolarity, and that's really what the meaning should be, and that unless we're moving towards something like that, then it should be called something else. But again, I get back to the point that we're not in the same place as we were during, say, the concert system in Europe, and that we now have an absolute rhetorical consensus between all the major powers on the United Nations being the core of the international system, of sovereignty and of international law. And so China and Russia invoked international law and the UN Charter at the center of all of their global statements. The United States traditionally has. I don't know what's happening at the moment, but that's been a core position of the United States, is that it still believes in the UN Charter as the center of the system. And so we're in a situation where there at least is this discourse about agreement on some common set of rules. It's just that everyone's disagreeing about what actually the UN Charter means, what international law means. And so then that distinguishes the current period from maybe some of these other periods of multipolarity, because there's this idea that there's something out there called international law that should be agreed upon by states. And so I think that even if there's a shift back to some of the previous structures of power, we're not in the same place normatively in terms of these current discourses in international law.
Yes.
One thing that occurs to me, and when I think of Chinese civilization in this context, I don't mean an ancient civilization. I mean a very, very short-lived one that started in the, say, Cultural Revolution to now. One thing that civilization, which is not to do with the Han culture, is one that just dealt with brutal repression and very systematic operational just acceptance of new stuff, right? Like paradigm shifts in that country just happen, right? And I mean this in that I think in a multipolarity world, they have an distinct advantage right now that has nothing to do, as I said, with Han. It's more that let's take potential new tariffs, and we're going to, anything under $800 would also be included. In the US, we have no capability of actually inspecting every package. We can't hire enough people. We would never be able to inspect every package. It would stomp on the freedoms of so many different things in local municipalities. It would be a distinct nightmare that even if we decide that's policy, would not be implemented in this, within the next 3.5 years, writ large. However, if I was in China and I said, here's a new rule, every local municipality would find a way to implement that in a month, right? So they would have, in a tit for tat, it's not even that they would win tit for tat, they could implement tit for tat much quicker. Same with Russia. I mean, there's no way, in terms of graft and all these things, like they, Putin from on high declares this is a new world order internally. I want all, Bic lighters to, go through 3 levels of security or whatever. Not going to happen. It's just not going to implement. But in China, they can implement that super quick. So they can deal with shocks. They already have very, all their factories are already automated. They don't need more jobs in per se. So when put in that perspective, is, call a Manchurian candidate or something like that. Is this basically a way for China to think about themselves as having the moral high ground and say like, oh yeah, we're not saying this, you guys are saying this, we're happy to go along, and they can just implement it way faster than the other potential hegemons?
You mean in terms of them calling it a civilization, or?
No, I mean, if we decide to blow up the rules-based order, and we go, here's all these rules that are advantageous to us.
Yeah.
Even if on paper they're more advantageous to us, I would argue that China has a distinct advantage to win because they can implement whatever tit for tat rules, but they can actually implement it. So we might be claiming that we'll, just to arbitrarily take we have these big tariffs, but we'd still have all this Xi'an flow through and all this stuff that just, even if it's against the law, will just keep flowing through because we can't, we'll be swamped. On the flip side, they could literally find ways to implement all kinds of things and actually implement them, not like just on paper. Like they would actually be able to create social rules. They could actually, make it so, Weibo or whatever can't do transactions. Like internally, in terms of their large economy and the surrounding economies, they have a lot more capability technically in a society level to just accept whatever the hell is coming down and go, okay, we'll get it done in a month. Here we have lawsuits, et cetera, et cetera.
So basically, to summarize, they can more efficiently implement sanctions. So
writ large, any
can win
rule.
the sanctions war. Okay, we only have a few minutes left, so.
I mean, that seems to get into some of the arguments about some of the advantages of autocracy also. And it's not autocracy alone, because of course, Russia's like a different example, but there's the bureaucracy and the autocracy in China allows for some of those advantages. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that's some of the messiness of the American system. So as I understand, some of the tariffs aren't even being implemented when goods come into the port in the United States and so on. And so then that's a problem of bureaucracy as well. But yeah, I think that China is kind of got its house in order in a sense to be able to do these things. And then some of these normative claims then seem to be more plausible when you've already got the systems in place.
Right. So last question.
Right.
Thank you. So there are lots of chaoses. I mean, uncertainties. If you look into your crystal ball, what would be the future? In particular, what international law would continue? Some of the rules seem to be very sort of resilient and sticking. If you look at the shipping law, for example, maritime law, will go back to the old British sort of empire. So if you say in the next few decades, what would be the new things would arise from the new geopolitics?
So what's going to happen in the world? I mean, it's going to depend on some of these configurations of power. So John Eikenberry, for instance, talks about the emergence of what he calls the global West, the global East, by which he means China and Russia, and the global South. And they're not exactly the same. Like it's that oversimplifies it a little bit. But essentially, the configurations of power between them, particularly as the global South rises economically, where it gives its allegiance, whether it supports the West or the East, or the configurations of power will then feed through, I think, into international law. I think that's the point, is that the structure of power that's underpinned international law since it's been understood since the end of the Cold War has fractured and is changing in ways that aren't completely predictable. And so I'm sort of studiously not answering the question in the sense I'm explaining like what I think will determine it is the structures of power. But I mean, it's anybody's crystal ball as to how actually these things will play out. But one of the possible futures is that will be the emergence of these geo-legal orders where international lawyers, practitioners, would have to understand the geographies of law when they're working with particular countries, of knowing actually how is law going to be interpreted in this context and how will it be interpreted in this context. You can't just look at the rule book of the WTO and know that this is how trade law works for everybody, that there's the discordant geographies, I think, will shape the international legal order.
Hmm. So I'm afraid we have to leave it here. I want to thank you very much. In these, we talk now about living through history, which of course we're always living in history. It's just sometimes we're more acutely conscious of living in history that seems to be moving more quickly. So anyone who can offer us frameworks for trying to make sense of what we're seeing is very welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, it's my great pleasure.